The photograph arrived the way old troubles usually do, quietly, in a plain envelope that looked too clean for what it carried. No return address, just a postmark from the west of Ireland, and a name written in careful, tired ink. When I slid the print out, the paper resisted a little, as if it had spent a century learning how not to be handled. It was a class portrait taken outdoors, the kind schools once made to prove they were orderly and thriving. If you're the sort of person who lingers over these things, I'd like you to stay close. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment as we go, the way you might press your hand to a door frame before stepping into a room you don't fully trust. I read every comment, especially on stories like this. The setting was unmistakably rural. A squat stone schoolhouse with a slate roof, narrow windows, a yard churned into dark mud. The light was flat and cold, Atlantic overcast, the kind that drains color from skin and turns every shadow into a bruise. 24 children were arranged in rows, knees together, hands folded, shoulders squared to the camera as if posture could keep the world from noticing hunger. Most were boys, though the ages were mixed in that way institutions liked. A small child pressed beside a tall one, the older forced into the role of silent guard. Their clothes didn't match, but they belonged to the same rough category: wool jumpers, shorts, heavy socks, boots worn at the toes. On the edges stood the adults, one in a long dark coat that suggested the church without needing a collar, another in tweed holding a ledger like a shield. At first, nothing screamed, the kind of picture you might find in a parish hall, tucked behind a glass frame, forgotten until someone cleaned. But the longer I stared, the more the photograph began to feel less like a memory and more like a document. Something made to be filed, not cherished. The children didn't look toward the camera so much as past it. A few had that resigned expression you see in institutional photos. Not fear exactly, but the practiced stillness of someone who has learned that movement invites correction. The person who mailed it included a single page of notepaper. They said they'd found the photo in a tin trunk during a house clearance outside Castlebar, County Mayo, among prayer cards, buttons, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The trunk had belonged to a woman named Myre Ní Chathasaig, a former teacher, dead now, no direct children. The family didn't know what to do with old school bits, so they sold most of it. But this photo bothered the sender enough to keep it back. They'd tried to identify the school and failed. On the back, in faint pencil, were 3 words and a date: June 1922. No school name, no townland, no class year. June 1922 is a month that doesn't sit still in Irish history. The country was splitting at its seams, old allegiances hardening into new violence. Records went missing, people went missing. And in times like that, institutions, the ones with stone walls and locked cupboards, often became convenient places to store the inconvenient. I took a magnifying glass to the print, not because I expected a miracle, but because small truths hide in the corners. That's when I saw it. A slate name board resting in the hands of a child in the front row, slightly right of center. It should have been simple: school name, maybe the class designation. But the chalk had been smeared, as if someone's thumb had dragged across it in haste. Under the expected line was another, darker one, a surname written twice, the same letters repeated as if the first attempt wasn't acceptable. And beside one of the repeats was a small chalk mark, like a cross, quick and deliberate. In old school photos, slates weren't decoration. They were accounting. They were proof of attendance, proof of order, proof that the right bodies were in the right place on the right day. A repeated surname isn't a flourish. It's a correction. It's someone making the image say something specific. I started where any sane person starts: lists. A rural boarding school in Mayo in the early 1920s narrows the possibilities, but not as much as you'd think. Some were small industrial schools, some were orphan homes with new names, some were training institutions that trained children for labor more than life. The sender gave me one more detail over the phone, voice low, as if saying it louder would summon someone from the doorway. They'd shown the photo to an older relative who claimed the building looked like the old St. Bridget's place. An institution locals spoke about the way they spoke about bad weather. Inevitable, unpleasant, and best not argued with. And then came the first true inconsistency, the thing that made my stomach tighten. In the same tin trunk, the sender found a partial roll book, loose pages, water-stained at the edges. On the June 1922 sheet, several names were legible. One surname appeared once in ink. In the photograph, it appeared twice in chalk, and next to one of them that cross. So the central question wasn't, who are these children? Not yet. It was simpler and worse. Why did someone need the photograph to carry a correction the records wouldn't? Why did a class portrait, meant to preserve a tidy moment, include an act of quiet editing in plain sight? If you feel that same discomfort settling in, stay with it. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment, not as applause, but as a way of saying you're here, and you're listening. I began with the things the photograph couldn't lie about: cloth, timber, stone, and the way people arranged their bodies when they were told to be grateful. I enlarged the print until the grain became its own weather. The boys' jumpers were coarse, homespun, or cheaply issued, but the cut was consistent enough to suggest a single source. An institution, not a village school where mothers patched and altered. Their boots were the same shape, even when the leather wasn't. And on several knees, front row, left side, I caught the faint rectangle of stitched reinforcement, the kind you add when you expect a child to spend his days on stone floors. The adults were easier. The man with the ledger held it like he'd been trained to keep his hand between truth and the world. His suit was plain but not poor. His shoes were kept. The other figure, dark coat, stood half a step behind the children's line, angled so the camera would see him without making him the center. It was a posture I'd seen in other institutional photographs. Authority present, but careful not to look like authority. I called a local historian in Mayo who'd spent years mapping vanished schools, places renamed, repurposed, quietly erased. He didn't ask for the photo's backstory first. He asked for the building. "Count the stones," he said, not joking. These houses were built like signatures. When I described the narrow windows, the bell frame, the dry stone wall leading off toward fields, he went quiet for a moment, then offered 3 possibilities. None of them ordinary boarding schools. One was a training home run under church oversight. Another had operated as a sort of overflow for children placed by local boards. The third was the one he didn't like saying aloud, because it carried a reputation that survived better than any paperwork. Then he told me something that shifted the air in the room. In the early 1920s, especially in the West, institutions sometimes kept parallel records. The clean one for inspectors, the real one for themselves. "If you want to know which one you found," he said, "look for repetition. Look for names that don't behave." So I did. The sender's rollbook page, June 1922, looked almost too tidy for a place that fed and housed children through upheaval. No blots, no marginal notes, no messy humanity, just columns, ruled lines, careful ink. But that tidiness was the first contradiction. The paper itself was watermarked and warped at the edges, like it had been rescued from damp, yet the writing sat on it as if it had been copied later, in calm hands, from something rougher, and the ink tone barely varied, as though one person had written the whole list in one sitting. I asked a conservator I know to look at high-resolution scans, not to do miracles, just to tell me if the page had been handled honestly. She pointed out what my eyes wanted to ignore: the pressure marks. In several places the pen had bitten deeper where a name repeated, as if the writer hesitated, pressed, then continued. Small, human stutters in an otherwise perfect document. I tracked down a woman in her 70s whose father had been sent to a Mayo institution as a boy. She didn't know the photo, but she knew the feeling of it. When I described the slate, the repeated surname, the cross-like chalk mark, she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's not a blessing," she said. "That's accounting. That's what you put beside a boy when you're changing what he's called, or when you're making him stand in for someone who isn't there." Her words gave me a theory that was uglier than my first. In places like this, names weren't always identities. They were categories, useful labels for forms, rations, transfers, If a child arrived without papers, if a child died, if a child was moved quietly, the name could be reassigned, folded into the list so the numbers still matched. And if the numbers matched, questions went away. But theory isn't proof. So I went hunting for the kind of paper trail that survives even when people try to scrub it. Parish notices, local newspapers, diocesan reports, board minutes, anything that might mention a building like that schoolhouse. The historian found an inspector's visit recorded around the same season, praising order and cleanliness in language that felt copied from older praise. The report listed enrollment totals, not names. The total matched the roll book. The photograph, though, if I counted faces carefully, came up short by one missing face, 2 identical surnames, a chalk cross, and the smallest detail, the one that finally convinced me the slate wasn't just sloppy handwriting. The smear itself, it wasn't random. It dragged left to right like a thumb trying to erase only the first name on that repeated line, leaving the surname intact. Someone didn't want the camera to capture a first name, only the family name that could be made to fit. By the time I set the photo down, it no longer felt like a class portrait. It felt like a controlled statement. These are the children we will admit to, under the names we can defend. Everything else stays off the paper. If you've been watching the same corner of the image I can't stop watching, leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Tell me what you think that little chalk cross was really doing there, and whether you've ever seen a document trying this hard to look innocent. The surname on the slate was legible enough to tempt me into certainty. I won't repeat it here, not because it's sacred, but because names deserve to be handled like glass when you still don't know who was forced to wear them. Instead, I chased it the way a clerk might have, through lists, registers, the places where a life becomes ink. The first route was the obvious one, and it failed fast. Parish baptismal books in that part of Mayo were full of the name, too full. Whole pages of it, branching families, cousins repeating cousins. If the slate was meant to identify a child, it did the opposite. It dissolved him into a crowd. For a day or two, I clung to the idea that the chalk cross was the old shorthand for death, the mark you'd put beside a name when someone didn't make it. It would have been a simple kind of tragedy, a grim, familiar one. But the people I spoke to, those who'd seen institutional paperwork from the inside, kept shaking their heads. In schools, you don't mark the dead like that, the historian said. You remove them. The false lead collapsed in a place I didn't expect, a diocesan archive, a room that smelled of dust and furniture polish, where the past is kept tidy to make it look less hungry. A clerk brought out a slim bundle of correspondence from the early 1920s, complaints, requests for repairs, petitions for coal. One letter mentioned an inspection of the home and praised the boy's appearance for the photograph. Not the photograph, but a photograph, as if it were routine. The letter wasn't signed with a school name. It was signed with a title, manager. That one word mattered. Village schools had principals, boarding schools had headmasters, but manager was the language of certified institutions, places that lived half in church authority, half in state oversight, administered like a business that traded in children. I went back to the image and looked again at the slate, not just the chalk. At the bottom edge, almost swallowed by glare, there was a faint embossed stamp, an oval impression in the board itself, not written, pressed. I'd missed it because it wasn't ink. It was texture. Proof without color. The conservator enhanced the scan and traced the outline. An official-looking seal used to mark property, the kind that said, quietly, "This belongs to an institution." A class slate was one thing, an institutional slate was another. It meant the photograph wasn't taken to commemorate a year. It was taken to inventory a cohort. And then the chalk cross began to change shape in my mind. Not a death mark, a notation, a status. The older woman I'd spoken to earlier called back after she'd slept on it. "My father used to say they'd cross you," she told me. "Not bless you, cross you out of yourself. If you were to be sent away, if you were to be placed out, if you were to become someone else on paper, that's how they'd do it." A little cross so the office knew the story had been edited. Placed out. The phrase landed like a stone. In Ireland then, Boys from institutions were sometimes sent into farm work or domestic labor, officially employment, unofficially a quiet relocation of responsibility. A child could vanish from a dormitory and reappear on a ledger as a solution. A mouth moved elsewhere. I tried to prove it with hard documentation and nearly ran into another wall of cleanliness. Minutes from local boards existed, but names were scarce. Totals were abundant. Children were counted like sacks of oats, received, housed, transferred. The only time individuals surfaced was when something went wrong, an escape, an illness, an accusation that threatened the institution's calm surface. That's when the second contradiction appeared, smaller than the first, but sharper. In an inspector's summary from the season, language stiff as starched linen, there was a line about recent transfers and appropriate arrangements made. The phrasing was so smooth it felt rehearsed. Yet the photograph, taken in that same month, showed faces arranged as if someone had insisted on including everyone who could still be made to stand still. Everyone except the one missing count I'd already noticed. The repeated surname on the slate wasn't just a correction. It was a substitution, one child's identity made to cover the absence of another, so the image would match the number the papers demanded. The chalk smear, dragged with a thumb, suddenly looked less like clumsiness and more like panic. Someone erased a first name that didn't belong there, replaced it with one that did, then added the cross to tell the office the switch had been completed. And in that single gesture, chalk, thumbprint, cross, the whole story tilted away from a rural boarding school photo and toward something colder, a system designed to keep its totals consistent even when its children were not. If you're holding that unease with me, stay close. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment in your own words the way you'd speak softly at the edge of a locked room and let someone inside know they're not alone. The proof arrived in a place that didn't feel like proof at all, an outbuilding behind a rectory, where paperwork was stored the way you store unwanted furniture, upright, crowded, and meant to be forgotten. The historian had pulled a thread for me, a reference to placements recorded separately from attendance. Not the roll book, not the inspector's clean summary. A third set of pages, thin, cheap paper, stamped and restamped, as if the ink itself needed supervision. The register was titled in careful hand, Out-Service Arrangements, no poetry in it. Just columns, date, child, destination, remarks. And there it was. The same surname from the slate, written once in ink, then again on the line below, as if the clerk had copied the rhythm of the chalk without knowing why. In the remarks column beside the second entry was a mark that stopped my breath. A small cross, angled just slightly, the same quick gesture as the one on the slate board. The first entry had a first name, the second didn't. Where a first name should have been, there was a blank space and the cross. A week later, I found the missing piece folded inside an unrelated file, a carbon copy letter from a teacher, Mayerni Chathasai, the woman whose trunk had held the photograph. It wasn't addressed to a newspaper or a court. It was addressed to the manager, and it read like a person trying not to sound like a person. She wrote about clerical confusion and the necessity of accurate naming. Then, in a line that broke her restraint, she mentioned a boy who had been sent out without proper papers. She didn't accuse anyone of harm. She didn't use dramatic language. She simply said the child's name had been replaced for the purposes of the photograph and the count. For the purposes of the photograph. I understood then why the slate mattered. Someone had realized the inspector would compare faces to numbers and numbers to the roll book, and they'd made a small, brutal edit to keep the surfaces smooth. The repeated surname wasn't a family with twins. It was a patch. The chalk cross wasn't mourning. It was a code that meant, this line is doing double work. The boy who vanished didn't vanish into a grave the way my early imagination wanted. Tragic, final, comprehensible. He vanished into bureaucracy, into arrangements, into a farm placement that the register described in a single word, suitable. Suitable for whom it never said. We tried to follow the trail past that word. The destination column listed a townland and an initial for the receiving household. That's where the story thinned, not because it ended, but because it was never meant to be thick in the first place. People who took children in under arrangements like these didn't always keep letters. Institutions didn't always keep receipts. The state that was being born in those months had other priorities than a boy whose name had been smudged out of a slate. Still, the photograph now looked different in my hands. It wasn't only a portrait of children forced into stillness. It was a message from someone inside the machine, Maere, who had kept the print like a splinter under the skin. Not enough to bring the whole structure down, but enough to make it ache. If she couldn't stop what was happening, she could preserve the evidence of how it was done. A thumbprint smear, a doubled surname, a cross that meant a child had been rearranged on paper. I went to the place the historian believed the building had stood. The schoolhouse is gone now. Stone taken for walls, slate reused, the yard swallowed by grass. But the land still has that west of Ireland quiet that feels older than any argument. Standing there, I realized the photograph's true cruelty. Every child in it had been made to pose for permanence, and yet one of them had been denied even the dignity of being missing honestly. He'd been replaced. What remains unsolved is the part that hurts to admit. We can't say with certainty what became of him after that arrangement. We can only say the system had a method for making his absence look tidy, and that someone, one tired teacher, one piece of paper, refused to let the tidiness be complete. If you want, leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Not as a ritual, just as a small sign you were here with me when the silence finally showed its handwriting.